Okay, so thank you for coming to the session today. We are going to be starting segment 4, last segment of the class. And this one is going to be about risk, beta, and diversification. So a lot of things you learned in segment 1 will carry through into, in segment 3 will carry through into segment 4. You'll see a lot of things that you already learned, and it will help you for segment 4. So today's going to be mostly introduction, getting started, learning the vocab words. So then when you get to the homework, it kind of makes more sense on what you're supposed to be looking for and everything. So let's get started. So again, remember, just use the chat today, and I have it open. So if you have any questions, just put your questions in the chat. So we're going to be starting with some terms, going through that, and then we're going to be doing an intro to segment 4 with Kahoot. I think Kahoot's a good way to get vocab and everything. Yeah. So the first thing that we're going to do, so in the chat, you can put your answers. So the terms that we're going to be first talking about are beta, risk-free rate, market risk premium, standard deviation, and diversification. So in the chat, you can pick one that you know. It can be 2 or 3. Anything that you know about these terms, I just want to see what you know, so just put it in the chat. Okay, so I'll start going through these terms. So I see a few answers in the chat. I think as we start going through these terms, it will kind of ring a bell with anything from econ class to stats class, and back to this class. So you guys will see some things that you've heard before. So one answer that we had in the chat was diversification is when you pick an index fund, and standard deviation is the amount of variation. So let's go through these terms. All right, so first thing that we have is beta. So beta is going to be a big thing in segment 4. You'll hear it for the rest of the semester pretty much. So I put the symbol, it's at like a fancy B. If you guys have taken stats classes, you've seen it many times. But we will be using beta a bunch. And it basically is the degree that the stock behaves with the stock market. And the market as a whole has a beta of 1, and the average stock in the market has a beta of 1. So a key thing to remember for some more of our analyses is using the market as a whole with a beta of 1. So when we get to comparing individual stocks to the market, that's what you'll use as a beta of 1. So this is beta. And again, if you guys have any questions throughout the slides, just put them in the chat. Okay, and then the next thing we're going to talk about is risk. So we kind of talked about risk last segment with time value money, and we talked about it with bonds, and the higher the risk, the price has it has an effect on price. It also has an effect on your required rate. So it's the same thing here. So risk is the likelihood results won't be as expected. It's a volatility of results, and it correlates with standard deviation. So the higher the standard deviation, the higher the risk. So you guys have heard risk before, so it's just something familiar. And then next, we are going to be talking about your required rate of return and CAPM. So CAPM is another thing that you will hear for the rest of the semester. It's some equations that you guys will really get familiar with within the sessions. We'll be doing a ton of practice problems, so the homework becomes a lot easier, which is always the goal. So the first bullet point says risk premium, and that equals your required rate of return, which should be familiar from segment 3. And the equation for your required rate of return is RF plus beta times RM minus RF. And so in segment 3, we talked about your RF, which is your risk-free rate. And again, just as a little refresher, that's your 3-month T-bill rate. So since you guys just had the test, hopefully it's still fresh in your minds. And then the RM is your market risk, and RM minus RF, that equals your market risk premium. So in the equation up top, you see inside the parentheses is your market risk minus your risk-free rate. That can also be substituted for a market risk premium. So for example, in a word problem, you might be given the market risk premium and your beta, and you have to solve for your required rate of return. And so you just have to solve for your risk-free rate. Or if you're given market risk premium and market risk and beta, that's how you just find risk-free rate. So it's basically just algebra and knowing how to solve for certain variables. So that is your risk premium or your required rate of return. That's the equation you use for this. Yeah, and so that is the start of CAPM. And the next thing that we're going to be looking at is a graph of diversification. So can I get a thumbs up? You guys can just do the little thumbs up if these words and the graph kind of look familiar from things you've learned in segment 3. All right. So I see some thumbs up. So hopefully, kind of. Okay, yeah. So some of the terms you see, like risk, we've talked about stock, we've talked about market risk. So some of that from segment 3 you'll see carry over to segment 4, and it'll actually make a lot more sense. So for diversification, here we have this graph. So on the y-axis, it's risk, and on the x is degree of diversification, and that's your number of stocks. So if you guys are into investing, you guys know that the more you diversify, the safer it is and the less risk you have, because in case something just totally falls off and it goes really bad, then you have less of a risk of losing all your money because you're more diversified. So that's the same idea here. So you see up top right here, if you have a low number of diversification, so you're really not diversified at all, that gives you a high amount of risk. Let's say you're only in one industry, that industry crashes, then you lose all your money right away. But the more you diversify, the more you go down this line, the less risk you take on. And then this dotted line that I have here is your market risk. And that line is measured with beta. So your diversification and risk will only go as far as the market risk. So that's kind of what this graph means. And so a lot of things for this segment, if you put it in real life examples like diversification, if you guys like investing, think of it in real life and what it would kind of mean for you guys. It helps a lot because it makes it really like use the Kahoot to do your homework and like learn the vocab. The more you know the vocab, just like all the other segments, the easier the word problems are and everything. All right, so let's start. Okay, so if I don't know if it showed, but some of these questions will be multi-answer, like two or more could be correct. So keep an eye out for some of these. I think it tells you on the question. But just like we talked about before, risk is the likelihood results won't be as expected, and it's also uncertainty concerning the occurrence of a loss. All right, awesome. So, risk, there are different types of risks that we're going to be talking about throughout the segment. So, we already kind of touched on market risk. There is company risk, and there's also systematic and unsystematic risk. So, again, throughout the segment, you'll hear about all three of these. We already started on market risk, and that will carry out throughout the whole segment. Um, and yeah. Okay, so this one kind of 50-50. So this is asking if non-diversifiable risk, market risk, and systematic risk are synonyms. So this is true. Again, just to reiterate, the purpose of this Kahoot is I don't expect you to know it on the before we even started day one of segment 4, but to have this learn a few things, kind of it will look familiar once you get it in class on Monday, but also know it for your homework. You guys have probably realized already by this point of the semester, um, the more you know the vocab and you're familiar with it, then word problems become that much easier. So really remember these three names of risk, and that if you see them in the word problem, they all mean the same thing. So don't think there's something different, and that'll just help you so much more. All right, so this one is asking which events can be categorized as systematic risk. So we see that red and yellow are systematic. So red is saying that Federal Reserve cut interest rates by 25 basis points on October 30th. So basis points is another vocab word that should sound familiar from segment 3. That was a big thing. And yellow saying that global financial crisis in 2008. So those are both systematic risk. And again, we'll be getting into more of that later in the segment. All right, so beta of the market portfolio. Um, so we kind of already talked about this in the beginning, but the beta of the market is 1. It'll always be 1, and we start doing comparisons between a company's beta versus the market. You'll always use 1 as your benchmark for the market. So remember that one. But when we get into betas of different companies, there is some calculations, but they're super simple. Um, and then you can do the market risk and all those different calculations. All right, awesome. So this one is good. So this is asking if the beta is the degree stock behaves with the market, and that is correct. Um, yeah. All right, awesome. So, diversification, again, we already talked about that with the graph, but it's basically the more you diversify, the less risk. So this is just saying that a portfolio of 10 stocks from different industries is more diversified than a portfolio of 10 stocks from one industry or a portfolio of only one stock. So with the red and the blue, clearly you'll have a lot more risk than you would with the yellow. Yellow is a lot safer, and you're a lot less likely to completely lose all your money at once. Um, can I get a thumbs up from you guys? Are any of you into investing? And do you feel like your guys is awesome? Do you guys feel like you guys are like diversified with the stocks that you invest in? Okay. Yeah, kind of. Um, well, I'm glad you're doing okay. Um, yeah, so it probably could be a little hard right now while we're kind of young, but to be fully diversified, but definitely as we make more money, it's probably a lot easier. You have more to invest in and everything. Okay. So for this one, this is saying that a line that describes the relationship between an individual security's returns and return on the market portfolio. So this is called a characteristic line. The security market line and the capital market line, um, especially the security market line, we will be talking about that for about a week straight. You guys will know that graph very, very well. We'll be doing it in sessions also. Um, so we'll get to that in a bit. But for this one, the characteristic line is the relationship of individual security returns and return on market portfolios. Okay, so for this one, risk-free security has a beta equal to 0. So that's true. Um, Again, for betas to kind of make more sense, I think it should be around, it might be next week. I'm not really too sure. But at some point soon, we'll be talking about the calculations for beta and a little more detail. So once you do the calculations, it'll make a lot more sense on like what they kind of mean with the market. It's a little difficult to describe without calculations, but we'll get into it and we'll get into it for the whole entire semester. So okay. So for this one, the greater the beta, the blank of the security market line, and this is saying the greater the unavoidable risk. Again, beta has a huge relationship, and you guys will see beta of 1, which is the market. When you compare that to your security market line, um, you'll see. But so for this one, the greater the beta, the greater the unavoidable risk. Okay, so for this one, um, a measure of risk per unit of return, that's going to be your coefficient of variation. Um, your correlation coefficient and standard deviation, again, you guys will hear them throughout the segment. Standard deviation, You guys have probably heard that in a stats class, at least econ class. Um, and that will come in a lot throughout a lot of the graphs we'll be talking about. And so for this one, your coefficient of variation, um, that's a measure of your risk. All right, awesome. So for this question in the chat, can you guys give me like a brief answer on why, if you have more standard deviation, you have more risk? Okay, that's okay if you're not sure. Um, I promise you in about 2 weeks, you'll have a full answer to why. Um, so if you guys remember, if you can picture like a um, graph like that, and you have the mean, and the further out you go in each standard deviation you go out, the further away you are from the mean, and the more like how do I say this? The more options, I guess you could say, you are out. So there's less, to say the least, wiggle room inside of that graph to land on somewhere inside that graph. So it's a lot more risky if you're talking about deviating away from market risk. All right, awesome. So, efficient frontier, another graph we will be talking about for a while. So, it is the max return for your investment that you're taking on, and it's also the optimal combination of risk and return. So, this is going to be a graph that you'll see, and if you're on that line at the right position, that's going to show you for the amount of risk that you decide to take on, that's going to be your optimal amount of return. So if you're right on that line, that's going to be your return. It's also going to show you the return that you will receive for taking on that amount of risk. So let's say you're planning out, you see that you're taking on this amount of risk, you'll see the max return that you can get for what your investment is. Okay, so Sharpe ratio, um, another important term for this segment. So Sharpe ratio combines your IRR, which we talked about when we did net present value. So that's your internal rate of return, and it combines that and your standard deviation. The Sharpe ratio also asks you if you're getting enough for your return. So as we go through it, we look at the different variables, and we start to learn each variable. You'll be able to pick apart the ratio and see each part of each variable will play a part in determining whether or not you're getting enough for your return. So that's an important part. Um, and again, we talked about IRR with your net present value, and that combines your different cash flows and your initial investments, and we have talked about standard deviation. So um, that is the Sharpe ratio. All right, awesome. So for this one, more diversification means you have a lower standard deviation, and that in turn means you have lower risk, and that in turn means you have a lower required rate of return. So hopefully now you're kind of see how segment 3 plays a part in segment 4, and how we talked about if you have a lower risk, you're going to have a lower required rate of return because the person who is giving out the investment is less worried whether or not you're going to default or not. So in this case, um, you diversify your stocks more, you have lower standard deviation, there's less risk that you're taking on because you're fully diversified, and in turn, you'll have a lower required rate of return. Okay, so for this one, if you have a lower required rate of return, you can pay more for a stock. So, um, can I get a thumbs up in the chat if you remember the graph or the little chart that was talked about in segment 3 with it was like a little seesaw and risk was on the one side and price was on the other. Do you guys remember that graph? Yeah, I think Professor Rodin probably drew it like 10 times. Um, so basically, the lower the required rate, then the higher the price because the investor still wants to make sure that they get the full amount of money back and a little more. So they're not going to get their full money or the amount of money they want extra with a lower price and a lower rate. Um, they're going to ask for a lower rate and a little higher price. Okay, so market risk, or you'll see it as RM, and your risk-free rate, which is RF, that will equal your market risk premium, which is also seen as RMP. So a big thing to remember is don't get confused with market risk and your market risk premium. They're two separate things, two separate variables. And if you use one in place of the other, you'll mess up your whole entire equation. So this goes back to the first equation that we talked about, and which incorporates your risk-free rate, your beta, and your market risk. So these are 3 important variables. And again, make sure you remember like market risk is RM and market risk premium is RMP. So don't get them confused. That's a big one that we see on some of the tests. Awesome. So stock behavior divided by market behavior does equal your beta. So this is something that we'll be doing comparisons with actual companies. So we'll take the stock and divide it by the market, and that's how you find beta, and then that's how you can compare it to the beta of the market. Okay, awesome. So required rate of return, this is what we were talking about a few questions ago, and this is what we were also talking about on one of the first slides. So Required rate of return does equal your risk-free rate plus beta times your market risk plus your risk-free rate. And just like we mentioned, you can substitute the market risk plus risk-free rate. You can substitute that for your market risk premium because the two added together equals your market risk premium. So if you're given your market risk premium in equation, you can just plug that in and solve it for that. You don't have to solve for the other one that you're missing. But on the other hand, if you're given, let's say you're given market risk premium, your market risk and beta, make sure you remember that if you're given market risk and not risk-free rate, you have to solve for the risk-free because you need that in the beginning of the equation. So then you would take your market risk premium and subtract your market risk to get your risk-free rate. So you just kind of have to do the algebra and swap the variables around to solve for another variable. All right, so risk-free rate, again, this is mentioned many times in segment 3, so I'm glad you remember it. So risk-free rate, really simple, that equals your 3-month T-bill rate, and that's what we use for a lot of calculations last segment. So it will continue on over. Awesome. So if a company has a beta close to 1, it means that it's safer. That is true. If a company if a company has a beta close to 1, that means it's close to the beta of the market. So that means it's safer because as the market goes up and down, the stock will follow very close to it, which means it won't be very volatile. It's a lot safer. You can also easily predict what your company is going to look like if you know what the market's going to look like, and then you know whether or not to pull a stock, to keep a stock, and anything like that. All right, awesome. So market risk, it is unsystematic and it cannot be avoided. It's the stock market. There's always going to be some risk. There's not much you can do about it. That's just the nature of it with a ton of people investing. So it cannot be avoided and therefore it is unsystematic. Okay, awesome. So for the Sharpe ratio, here we see 3 variables that we've already talked about, 2 of which were in last segment, and combined into one equation. So this gives you the Sharpe ratio. So it's taking your internal rate of return minus your risk-free rate, and then that answer is divided by your standard deviation. So that is how you get your Sharpe ratio. All right, treasury bills. So treasury bills have a beta of 0. That is true. We'll look into different types of everything and see what their beta is when we get into more analysis of them. Okay, so um, When the overall market is up by 10%, an investor with a portfolio of defensive stocks will probably have, so for this one, the answer is positive portfolio and it returned less than 10%. So again, this is just another comparison with the market and the type of stock. So this is defensive. It'll have a different impact of your return when the market changes. So you'll still have positive, but it will be less than 10%. Okay, so the average of beta values for all individual stocks is 1. So the average of all the stocks does represent the market. That's how you get the market beta. And again, we talked about this a few times now. So just remember that the beta of the market and the beta of all stocks, the average, will be 1. Okay, so for this one is true. So if a project should be accepted if the return plots above the security market line. So again, we'll be talking about the security market line for like a week throughout this segment. But if you have return above it, then it should be accepted. Below it, clearly, then it should not be. It will not. The cost return relationship will not be a good one, and it should not be accepted. All right, together. And all right, all right, so that's all for today. Sessions on Monday, like I said.